My name is Dana Whitfield, and for 11 years I served as a Criminal Investigation Division agent in the United States Army. I spent my career learning how to read people, how a liar's shoulders tighten half a second before they speak, how a forged signature carries a hesitation in the pen stroke that the naked eye almost never catches, how guilt sits differently in a room than grief does. I never imagined I'd need every one of those skills just to survive a Tuesday afternoon in a small-town probate courtroom, sitting across from my own brother. Our father, Colonel Harold Whitfield, passed away in March after a long fight with heart disease. He was a proud man, a career military officer himself, the kind of father who measured love in discipline and duty rather than soft words, but I never doubted, not for 1 second, that he loved my brother Rowan and me equally. Which is exactly why what happened 4 months after his funeral broke something in me that I don't think will ever fully heal. Rowan had always been the golden child in a certain sense, louder, more social, better at making people like him instantly. I was the quiet one, the one who joined the army instead of business school, the one who spent holidays overseas more often than at the family table. Growing up, I never resented that dynamic. I loved my brother. I still do, somewhere underneath all of this. But love doesn't stop people from doing terrible things when money enters the picture. 2 weeks after the funeral, our father's will was read. It was straightforward. The house and the majority of his savings were left to me, with a smaller portion, still substantial, 6 figures, going to Rowan, along with our father's classic car collection, which Rowan had always loved far more than I had. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office thinking the split made sense. Dad and I had grown closer in his final years, especially after Rowan's second divorce left him distracted and, frankly, distant from the family for long stretches. I'd been the one driving him to cardiology appointments. I'd been the one sitting with him during chemo for the cancer scare 2 years before the heart finally gave out. None of that was a competition to me. It was just what you do for a parent. Rowan didn't see it that way. At first, he was quiet about his anger, a few clipped phone calls, a distant tone at family gatherings, comments dressed up as jokes that weren't really jokes. "Must be nice being Dad's favorite," he'd say, forcing a laugh that never quite reached his eyes. I let it go. Grief does strange things to people, and I told myself he'd come around once the rawness of losing Dad faded. He didn't come around. He escalated. 3 months after the will was read, I received a certified letter informing me that Rowan had filed a formal petition in probate court, contesting the will's validity. The claim, that I had unduly influenced our father during his final, medically vulnerable months, and, this was the part that made my stomach drop when I read it, that the signature on the final version of the will, the one that favored me, didn't match our father's signature on earlier documents. He was accusing me, in writing, filed with the court, of forging our father's will. I sat in my kitchen holding that letter for a long time. Not because I was afraid of the accusation itself. I knew it was false, and I knew, better than almost anyone, exactly how forgery investigations worked, since I'd built a career on catching people who did precisely what Rowan was accusing me of. What stunned me was that my own brother, who had grown up in the same house, eaten dinner across the same table, watched the same father slowly weaken over 2 years of illness, was willing to stand in front of a judge and call me a criminal to get a bigger piece of an inheritance he felt entitled to. The court date was set for a Tuesday morning in early July. I hired a probate attorney, a calm, methodical woman named Ms. Alvarez who specialized in contested estates, and I told her everything, including, quietly, in our first meeting, exactly what my career had been before I retired from active duty 18 months earlier. She raised an eyebrow, made a note, and said very little, which I'd later understand was entirely intentional. What Rowan didn't know, what nobody outside of Ms. Alvarez and one retired colleague I trusted implicitly knew, was that I hadn't spent the last 6 months simply mourning our father and quietly absorbing my brother's escalating hostility. I'd spent them doing what 11 years of training had wired into me instinctively the moment something felt wrong: documenting, cross-referencing, building a timeline. Not because I expected a courtroom fight over forgery. I genuinely hadn't seen that particular accusation coming, but because something about Rowan's behavior in the months before Dad's death and the strange urgency with which he pushed for certain financial decisions during Dad's final year, had never sat right with me. I walked into that courtroom on the morning of the hearing wearing a plain gray suit, no medals, no rank insignia, nothing to suggest I'd spent over a decade investigating exactly the kind of fraud my brother was now accusing me of. Rowan sat at the opposing table with his own attorney, refusing to look at me, jaw tight, clearly rehearsed and ready to perform outrage for the judge. He had no idea what was sitting in the folder on Ms. Alvarez's desk. The hearing opened with routine formalities, the judge, a sharp-eyed woman named Judge Marisol Chen, reviewing the petition, confirming both parties were present, laying out the scope of what she'd be hearing that day. Rowan's attorney, a young, aggressive man named Mr. Kessler, wasted no time. He stood, straightened his jacket, and launched into an opening statement painting a picture of a grieving, vulnerable elderly man manipulated in his final months by a daughter who had unusual proximity to his medical and financial affairs. I sat still. I'd learned a long time ago that stillness unsettles people far more than reaction does. Rowan, 2 seats down, kept glancing at me sideways, waiting for a flinch, a crack, something. I gave him nothing. When it was our turn, Ms. Alvarez rose and, in a calm, almost conversational tone, began laying out the actual timeline. She explained that our father had used the same estate attorney, Mr. Holloway, for over 15 years, and that the final will had been drafted and witnessed in Mr. Holloway's office, not at our father's bedside, not under any medical duress, but in a scheduled appointment 2 years before his death, well before his final decline. She submitted Mr. Holloway's notarized records, his own sworn statement confirming he'd met privately with our father, discussed the changes at length, and found him lucid, clear, and entirely of sound mind. Rowan's attorney pushed back immediately, pivoting to the forgery claim, insisting the signature on that final will showed clear inconsistencies compared to earlier documents, and that an independent audit was necessary before the court could accept its validity. This was the moment Ms. Alvarez had been waiting for. She opened the folder. Inside were 3 things I had spent months compiling, largely without even knowing exactly why I was compiling them, only that instinct told me to. The first was a full forensic handwriting analysis, commissioned quietly, months earlier, by me, from a certified document examiner I'd worked with twice during my Army career on fraud cases. The analysis confirmed, with detailed methodology the examiner would later testify to directly, that the signature on the will was consistent with our father's authenticated signature across multiple verified documents spanning 15 years, including his military retirement paperwork, his mortgage refinance, and his last passport renewal. The second was something Rowan didn't know I had: bank records. During Dad's final year, I'd noticed irregular withdrawals from his primary checking account, amounts that didn't match his usual spending patterns, timed suspiciously close to visits Rowan had made during a period when he claimed to be helping Dad manage his finances, after a minor stroke scare left our father temporarily less mobile. At the time, I hadn't accused anyone of anything. I'd simply done what SID training taught me to do when something felt inconsistent. I quietly requested account statements, with Dad's own permission, framed as helping him keep things organized during his recovery. Dad, ever trusting, ever unaware of what those documents would eventually reveal, signed the authorization without a second thought. Over an 8-month window, nearly $47,000 had moved out of our father's account in a series of withdrawals and transfers, several of them made using a power of attorney document Rowan had quietly had our father sign during that same helping him manage finances period, a document our father, in his more lucid final months, had actually tried to revoke, telling his estate attorney he didn't remember agreeing to give Rowan that kind of control, and wanted it undone immediately. The third item in the folder was the revocation letter itself, signed by our father 4 months before his death, formally rescinding the power of attorney, a letter Mr. Holloway confirmed he had drafted at Dad's explicit, urgent request, after our father grew increasingly uneasy about withdrawals he didn't recall authorizing. The courtroom went very quiet. Judge Chen looked up from the documents, then over at Rowan, whose face had gone from confident to pale in the span of about 90 seconds. Mr. Whitfield, she said evenly, would you like to explain the nature of these withdrawals, given that they occurred during a period in which you held power of attorney over your father's finances, power your father apparently attempted to revoke shortly before his death? Rowan's attorney tried to interject, something about needing time to review these documents, but Judge Chen held up a hand. Counsel, your client accused his sister of forgery and undue influence. I'd like to understand why nearly $50,000 left his father's account under his own authority before we proceed further with that accusation. I watched my brother, for the first time in this entire ordeal, look genuinely afraid. I felt no satisfaction in that moment. I want to be honest about that. I felt something closer to grief, a confirmation of something I'd suspected for months but had desperately hoped wasn't true, that my brother hadn't just been angry and grieving and lashing out irrationally. He'd been covering something, and the forgery accusation against me hadn't been a misguided outburst of grief. It had been a preemptive strike. Rowan's attorney requested a brief recess, and Judge Chen granted 15 minutes. I watched my brother and Mr. Kessler retreat into the hallway, Rowan's voice a harsh, urgent whisper even through the closed door, though I couldn't make out the words. Ms. Alvarez leaned over and murmured, that went about as well as it could have. He wasn't expecting the bank records. Neither was I. 6 months ago, I admitted quietly. I didn't build that folder to win a court case. I built it because something felt wrong, and I didn't know what yet. She gave me a look I couldn't quite read, something between respect and pity, and said nothing else before the recess ended. When we reconvened, Mr. Kessler's tone had shifted noticeably. Gone was the aggressive certainty from his opening statement. He now attempted a more careful, defensive framing, that Rowan had been assisting our father with finances in good faith, that any withdrawals were for our father's benefit, home repairs, medical equipment, various expenses, and that the timing of the power of attorney revocation was simply our father being confused during a difficult period of declining health, not evidence of anything improper. Judge Chen didn't look convinced. Counsel, I have bank statements showing transfers to an account that isn't a home repair vendor or a medical supplier. It's a personal account under your client's name. If these funds were used for your client's father's benefit, I'd expect documentation, receipts, invoices, something beyond an assertion. She turned a page. I also have a signed, notarized letter from the deceased, drafted by his own longtime estate attorney, explicitly stating he did not authorize several of these withdrawals and no longer trusted his son to manage his finances. That's a significant allegation to simply wave away as confusion. I watched Rowan shift in his seat, his jaw working, and for a moment I saw something in his face I hadn't seen since we were kids, that same look he used to get when our parents caught him in a lie about grades or curfew, cornered and calculating his way out rather than simply admitting fault. Some patterns, I realized watching him, never really change, they just get more expensive. Ms. Alvarez rose again, and this time she called her own witness, the forensic document examiner, a soft-spoken man named Drive Feldstein, who had spent 30 years testifying in exactly this kind of case. He walked the court through his methodology in plain, careful language, stroke pressure, letter formation consistency, the natural variance found in genuine signatures versus the telltale rigidity often found in traced or copied ones. He testified, without hesitation, that our father's signature on the final will showed every hallmark of authenticity and none of the red flags associated with forgery. Mr. Kessler's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. He tried to suggest Drive Feldstein's analysis was commissioned by an interested party, meaning me, and therefore potentially biased. Dr. Feldstein calmly replied that his findings were based on objective forensic methodology used and accepted in courts nationwide, and that he had no financial stake in the case's outcome beyond his standard consulting fee, which he'd have earned regardless of the conclusion he reached. Then it was my turn. Ms. Alvarez called me to testify, and as I walked to the stand, I felt 11 years of training settle over me like a second skin. I wasn't nervous. I'd testified in far higher stakes proceedings than this, court-martial hearings, federal fraud cases, situations where the outcome affected not inheritance but people's freedom. This was, in some strange way, easier. I only had to tell the truth. Ms. Alvarez asked me to describe my professional background. I explained, plainly, without embellishment, that I'd served 11 years as an Army SID special agent, specializing in fraud, forgery, and financial crimes investigations, and had retired at the rank of Chief Warrant Officer 18 months prior. I watched several faces in the courtroom shift when I said this, a flicker of understanding crossing Judge Chen's face, a visible tightening in Rowan's shoulders, the quiet recognition finally landing that the sister he'd accused of forgery had spent over a decade of her career catching exactly the kind of person he was now revealing himself to be. Ms. Whitfield, Judge Chen said, when Ms. Alvarez finished her direct examination, given your professional background, I have to ask directly, at what point did you begin suspecting something irregular in your father's finances? I answered honestly, about 10 months before he passed, Your Honor. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he didn't remember signing some paperwork Rowan had brought him. I didn't accuse anyone of anything at the time. I simply started documenting, quietly, because that's what my training taught me to do. When something doesn't add up, you don't confront, you verify. And when did you conclude your brother may have acted improperly? I glanced, briefly, at Rowan. He was staring at the table now, unable to meet my eyes. Honestly, Your Honor, not until today. I had suspicions. I had documentation. But some part of me kept hoping I was wrong. The courtroom was silent for a long moment. Judge Chen made a note, then looked directly at Rowan. Mr. Whitfield, she said, I think it's time you told this court the truth about where that money went. Rowan sat frozen for a long moment, and I watched something in him finally give way, not dramatically, not with tears or shouting, but with the quiet, exhausted collapse of a man who has run out of angles to work. His attorney leaned over and whispered something urgent in his ear, but Rowan shook his head slightly, and when he spoke, it was directly to the judge, not through counsel. I was in debt, he said, his voice flat, stripped of the performance he'd walked in with. Bad debt. Business debt, from a restaurant venture that failed 2 years ago. I hadn't told anyone, not Dad, not Dana, nobody. I was afraid of what everyone would think, especially after my divorce, after everything already falling apart. When Dad had that stroke scare and needed help managing his accounts, it felt like an opportunity I didn't plan for, exactly, but one I didn't stop myself from taking either. Judge Chen's expression didn't change, but her tone sharpened slightly. You're testifying, under oath, that you used your power of attorney to withdraw funds for personal debts unrelated to your father's care. Yes, Rowan said quietly. Some of it went toward his home, a new water heater, some repairs. But most of it went to me. I told myself I'd pay it back before he ever noticed. I told myself it wasn't really stealing, because I was still his son, still going to inherit eventually anyway, so what did the timing really matter? I felt something twist in my chest hearing him say that out loud. Not shock, exactly, since the bank records had already told me most of this story months ago, but a strange, hollow grief at hearing him finally admit it, plainly, in his own voice, in a room full of strangers. And the forgery accusation against your sister, Judge Chen continued. Where did that originate? Rowan was quiet for a long moment. When he answered, his voice had gone even smaller. Dad found out. Near the end. He confronted me about the withdrawals, and I panicked, and I told him I'd fix it, I'd pay it back, but he wasn't having it. He revoked the power of attorney, and I knew that when the will was read and Dana got the larger share, questions might eventually come up about where money had gone during my period of control. I thought if I could discredit the will itself, make it about her, make it about forgery and undue influence, nobody would ever look closely at what I'd actually done with those withdrawals. It was supposed to be about her. It was never supposed to actually be investigated. You mean, Judge Chen said, her voice cool, you attempted to use this court to falsely accuse your sister of a felony, in order to distract from your own financial misconduct toward your father. Rowan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence answered for him. I sat very still in the gallery, watching my brother unravel in real time, and I found myself thinking, unexpectedly, not about vindication, but about our father, about the conversation he must have had with Rowan in those final months, the hurt and disappointment he must have felt discovering that the son he'd trusted with his finances had quietly been draining them. I thought about how frightened Dad must have been, in his last year of life, realizing he needed to protect himself, legally and financially, from his own child. I thought about how he'd never told me any of this directly. He'd simply revoked the power of attorney, updated nothing else about the will's structure since it had already reflected his wishes for years, and quietly trusted the paper trail to speak for him when he no longer could. He'd been right to trust it. Judge Chen addressed the courtroom. Given the testimony and documentary evidence presented today, I find no credible basis for the petitioners' claims of forgery or undue influence regarding the will of Colonel Harold Whitfield. The will, as drafted and executed under the supervision of a licensed estate attorney, with the deceased found to be of sound mind at the time of execution, stands as valid. She paused, looking at Rowan directly. I am, however, deeply troubled by the evidence suggesting misuse of a power of attorney and will be referring this matter for further review, including potential civil liability for the recovery of misappropriated funds, and I strongly encourage the estate's counsel to consider whether criminal referral is appropriate given the amounts and circumstances involved. The word, criminal, landed in the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. Rowan's attorney's face went rigid. Rowan himself simply closed his eyes. I should have felt triumphant. I'd been accused of forgery by my own brother, dragged into a courtroom to defend not just an inheritance but my integrity, my career, the very things I'd spent 11 years building my reputation on, and I'd been vindicated, completely, on the record, in front of a judge who now understood exactly what had actually happened. Instead, walking out of that courtroom that afternoon, all I felt was tired. And underneath the tired, something worse, the quiet, growing understanding that whatever relationship Rowan and I had left, however fractured it already was, had just been buried under something neither of us would likely ever be able to fully dig back out from. The days after the hearing passed in a strange, muted blur. Ms. Alvarez called twice to walk me through next steps, the estate's formal recovery process against Rowan for the misappropriated funds, the probate court's referral moving through channels, a preliminary conversation with a county prosecutor's office about whether criminal charges would actually be pursued or whether this would settle into a civil matter, quietly, the way these things sometimes do when families would rather avoid the spectacle of one sibling testifying against another in a criminal trial. I told her I didn't want him to go to prison. She looked at me carefully when I said it, the way she had in our very first meeting, and said, "That's not really your decision anymore, Dana. It's the prosecutor's, and frankly, given what's on record, it may not even be his." But I understand why you'd say that. I understood it too, sitting with it that night, alone in the house I now legally owned outright, the same house I'd grown up in, the same kitchen table where Rowan and I had done homework as kids, where our father had once patiently taught us both to play chess, insisting neither of us win just because we were young. I thought about how proud Dad had been when I joined the army. How disappointed, quietly, he'd been about some of Rowan's choices over the years, not angrily, never cruelly, but with that particular parental sadness of watching a child struggle to find solid ground. I wondered, sitting there, whether some part of Dad had sensed what Rowan might eventually do, and whether that's part of why he'd been so careful, so deliberate, about documenting his own wishes so thoroughly before he passed. Rowan didn't call me. I hadn't expected him to, not really, but some small, stubborn part of me had held out hope regardless, the part of me that still remembered him as a kid sneaking into my room during thunderstorms, not so different from the sister in stories I'd sometimes read about other families, the part that still wanted, somehow, for this to resolve into something salvageable. It was our aunt, Dad's younger sister Miriam, who finally reached out, 2 weeks after the hearing. She'd heard everything secondhand, the community was small enough that little stayed private for long, and she asked, gently, if I wanted to talk. I keep thinking I should feel relieved, I told her. The court cleared me, publicly, on the record. Everyone who might have doubted me now has documented proof I did nothing wrong. That should feel like enough. But it doesn't, Miriam said. It wasn't a question. He's my brother, I said. I spent 6 months quietly building a case against him without even fully admitting to myself that's what I was doing, because some part of me refused to believe he could actually do something like this. And I was right to build it, because he did do it. But being right doesn't feel like winning. It just feels like losing something differently than I expected to. Miriam was quiet for a moment before she said something I've thought about often since. Your father spent his whole life training people to see the truth clearly, even when it's painful. That's what soldiers do, that's what you did for a living. But seeing the truth clearly about someone you love doesn't make loving them any easier. It just means you can't lie to yourself about who they are anymore. 3 weeks later, the district attorney's office informed Ms. Alvarez they'd be pursuing formal charges against Rowan for financial exploitation of an elder and forgery of the power of attorney extension documents, a detail that had emerged during the broader investigation, revealing Rowan had actually forged an extension of the original power of attorney after our father first attempted to revoke it, buying himself a few more months of access before Dad finally involved his attorney directly to shut it down for good. The irony wasn't lost on me. The forgery accusation Rowan had leveled against me, publicly, aggressively, in a courtroom. It turned out to describe, almost exactly, a crime he himself had actually committed. Rowan's case moved through the system slowly, the way these things do, a plea negotiation eventually replacing what would have been a public trial, largely, Ms. Alvarez explained, because the evidence was simply too thorough to fight. Forensic handwriting analysis on the forged power of attorney extension. Bank records with no ambiguity left in them. His own sworn courtroom admission, on record, about the original withdrawals. In the end, he pled guilty to a reduced charge, avoided prison time in exchange for probation, mandatory restitution, and a formal financial exploitation conviction that would follow him for the rest of his life. He was ordered to repay the estate in full, a process that would take years given his financial situation, monitored by the court. I didn't attend the sentencing. I'd given my testimony, told my truth, and I found I didn't need to watch the final chapter of it play out in person. Ms. Alvarez told me afterward, gently, that Rowan had cried during his statement to the court. Not performative tears this time, she said, but something that looked like genuine, exhausted grief. I don't know if that's true. I wasn't there to see it. Part of me hopes it was real. Part of me has learned, the hard way, not to trust my read on my brother anymore, professional training or not. It's been 4 months now since the hearing. I still live in Dad's house, my house, technically, though some part of me still hears it that way in my head, still expects to hear his slow, deliberate footsteps coming down the hallway some mornings before I fully wake up and remember he's gone. I kept the chess set from the kitchen table. I haven't been able to bring myself to play, not yet, not with anyone. Rowan reached out once, in writing, a short letter that arrived at the house about 2 months after his sentencing. He didn't ask for forgiveness, exactly. He wrote that he understood if I never wanted to speak to him again, that he knew what he'd done, both to Dad and to me, and that he wasn't asking me to fix anything, only that he wanted me to know he was in therapy now, actually confronting the debt and the shame and whatever had made him think erasing me was easier than admitting his own failures. I read it twice. I haven't written back yet. I don't know if or when I will. Some doors, I've learned, don't need to be slammed shut forever to stay closed for a while. What I keep coming back to, in the quiet months since, isn't the vindication, though I won't pretend that didn't matter, standing in that courtroom and hearing a judge state plainly, on the record, that I had done nothing wrong. What I keep coming back to is something closer to what Miriam told me that day on the phone, that seeing someone clearly doesn't make loving them easier. It just means you stop lying to yourself about who they are. I spent 11 years learning to read people for a living, soldiers, suspects, witnesses, the small tells that separate truth from performance. I never imagined the hardest case of my career would be my own brother, sitting across a courtroom, calling me a thief while I quietly held the proof of who the thief actually was. I don't regret staying silent as long as I did. I don't regret finally speaking when it mattered. And I don't regret, even now, still hoping, carefully, at a distance, without illusions, that someday, the brother I remember from before all of this might actually exist again, on the other side of everything he still has to face. Until then, I have the truth. I have the house. I have the chess set waiting on the kitchen table. And for the first time in a long time, I have peace with the fact that some things, some people, you can't save. You can only refuse to let them rewrite what actually happened.